So we got Galatians 2:15 and 16. ESV reads, "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified." I think it's important to start off by asking ourselves some questions of the text, and we're going to do that right here in the commentary. So let's see if we can catch the gist of it. I don't know how far we're going to get tonight. I never do. But this particular section, 2:15 and 16, these verses, covers, if you can see me scrolling down through the screen, covers probably 2 or 3 pages before we start picking up the comments again on verse 19. Remember, this is not a verse by verse. I don't cover every verse. Instead, by design, I only hit the verses that I feel have historically carried a lot of baggage with them as they get tossed around between traditional Christian theology and between now traditional Messianic theology. Obviously, the Messianic groups are pro-Torah, and they're in favor of continuing following after the law of Moses. And obviously by now, most Christian groups are in favor of not following after the law of Moses, at least as is described by the Messianics as keeping the Sabbath, keeping kosher, following after the festivals, putting a mezuzah on your door, wearing tzitzit, some of the more visible signs of Torah observance that most of us are familiar with. In reality, both groups are following after Torah, and if you believe in Yeshua, name the name of Yeshua as Messiah, then you are keeping the central part of the Torah. So in reality, I try to be careful with the words I use. I don't really tell Christians that they're not keeping Torah, because I think that's misleading, and I think it just simply, it sends the wrong signal, and it's hurtful. Because in reality, Christians are keeping Torah. They just don't know, perhaps, or they don't describe it that way. They don't articulate it that way, but they really are keeping Torah. But they aren't actually following the parts that, this is going to sound really strange to some of you, but they aren't keeping the parts that, oddly enough, would make them resemble Jews or make them look Jewish if they were to actually do them. In other words, keep the Sabbath, keep kosher, practice circumcision, things like that. Those are the ones that make people look Jewish when you keep them. And that's really the challenge, right? Should they make you look Jewish? Are they supposed to make you look Jewish? Etc. Let's read my commentary and see if we can get some answers. Comments to 2:15 and 16. And I hope that those of you who are following my commentary have followed me for a reasonable length of time, because you're going to find out now that this section, these few verses, are really a kind of a chair passage section. They're kind of a foundational point of Paul's rebuke to Peter and to those of us who are reading Paul's letters 2,000 years later. How does a man become justified in the eyes of the Almighty? Of course, it seems to be an age-old law versus grace discussion. Are we saved by grace, or are we saved by works? And there is an aspect of that in this passage. We're not justified by works, but through faith. At the very simplest level, that is true, that there's a contest in Paul's mind, meaning he's discussing this idea that was prevalent in the first century. How does a man become justified? This Greek word dikaiosune, or in the Hebrew we would talk about, how does one become a tzaddik, a righteous man? Today we can just use standard kind of Christian lingo, Christianese, and just say, how does a person become saved and then sanctified afterwards? How do we get brought into the family group of God? That's really the big question. So let's listen to Paul, at least my comments. The background behind understanding these important 2 verses was addressed in section 4 above under Works of the Law Part 2. And if you don't recall what I said there, please go back and look at that sometime so you can get a full treatment. This is just going to be kind of a snapshot of that. Verse 15 states, "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners." Right? Paul's got this idea of Jews by birth, Gentile sinners. What's going on there? Let's start with Tim Haig's commentary. He writes in his Galatians commentary on page 67 that the key to understanding this cryptic phrase is in knowing that it is not coming from the mouth of Paul. Right, even though Paul wrote it, perhaps Paul is repeating someone else's thoughts, where he says, we're Jews not by birth. And I'm going to see if I can approximate this in my voice using my inflection for a moment, so you can get the idea of what I think Tim Haig's trying to convey. Rather, I go on to say, or rather, Tim Haig goes on to say, rather, he is simply restating the popular views of the influencers he's arguing against. Remember, the influencers is a name that that I and Tim Haig and Mark Nanos have decided to call what most people would refer to as the Judaizers. I go on to say in my commentary, I think Haig's point is a strong probability that Paul might be actually using the words of someone else here. We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. To be sure, in Paul's day, to call a Gentile a sinner, right, was from a Jewish point of view kind of derogatory. It was something sha'ul likely would not have endorsed, and that's why I don't think it's Paul's words to say we're not Gentile sinners. Because Paul had a deep love for the Gentiles, especially after Yeshua opened his eyes to understand how the Gentiles fit into the program of God. So the established Judaic view of Gentiles, however, in Paul's day, allowed for them, the Gentiles, to be labeled by the, quote, authentic covenant members, end quote, as such.